The Face of War by Martha Gellhorn. The third winter, November 1938. In Barcelona it was perfect bombing weather. The cafes along the Ramblas were crowded. There was nothing much to drink. A sweet fizzy poison called orangeade, and a horrible liquid supposed to be sherry. There was, of course, nothing to eat. Everyone was out enjoying the cold afternoon sunlight. No bombers had come over for at least 2 hours. The flower stalls looked bright and pretty along the promenade. The flowers are all sold, señores, for the funerals of those who were killed in the 11 o'clock bombing, poor souls. It had been clear and cold all day yesterday, and probably would be fair from now on. "What beautiful weather," a woman said, and she stood holding her shawl around her, staring at the sky. "And the nights are as fine as the days." "A catastrophe," she said, and walked with her husband toward a cafe. It was cold, but really too lovely, and everyone listened for the sirens all the time. And when we saw the bombers, they were like tiny silver bullets moving forever up across the sky. It gets dark suddenly, and no street lights are allowed in Barcelona, and at night the old town is rough going. It would be a silly end, I thought, to fall into a bomb hole, like the one I saw yesterday, that opens right down to the sewers. Everything you do in war is odd, I thought. Why should I be ploughing around after dark, looking for a carpenter in order to call for a picture frame for a friend? I found Hernandez's house in a back street, and I held my cigarette lighter above my head to see my way down the hall and up the stairs, and then I was knocking on the door, and old Mrs. Hernandez opened the door and asked me to come in, to be welcome. Her house was mine. "How are you?" I said. "As you see," old Hernandez said, and he pushed his cap back on his forehead and smiled. "Alive." It wasn't much of a home, but they looked very handsome in it. A wick floating in a cup of oil lighted the place. There were 4 chairs and a big table and some shelves tacked on the wall. The 10-year-old grandson was reading close to the burning wick. The daughter-in-law, the wife of their youngest son, played quietly with her baby in a corner. Old Mrs. Hernandez had been working over the stove, and the room was smoky. What they would have to eat would be greens, a mound of cabbage leaves the size of your fist, and some dry bread. The women start cooking greens long in advance because they want to get them soft, at least. Boiled, flavorless greens go down better if they are soft. The picture frame was not ready. Hernandez could not get the wood. Wood is for dugouts and trenches, bridges, railroad ties, to prop up bombed houses, to make artificial arms and legs, for coffins. He used to collect the fragments from destroyed houses, he said. Not to work with, but for firewood. But now that is all saved for the hospitals. It was hard to be a carpenter. There wasn't much wood or much work any more. "Not that it matters about me," Hernandez said. "I'm very old." The little boy had been listening. His grandmother kept looking at him, ready to silence him if he interrupted while his elders spoke. "What do you do all day?" I said. "I stand in the foot line." "Miguel is a good boy," Mrs. Hernandez said. "He does what he can to help his old grandmother." "Do you like doing that?" I said. "When they fight," he said, laughing to himself, "it is fun." His grandmother looked shocked. "He does not understand," she said. "He is only 10. The poor people, they're so hungry, sometimes they quarrel among themselves, not knowing what they do." They put up a sign on the shop door, and word flies through the neighborhood that you can get food today. Then the lines form. Sometimes they are 5 blocks long. Sometimes you wait all that time, but just before your turn comes, the shop closes. There is no more food. The women wait in line and talk or knit. The children invent games that they can play standing in one place. Everyone is very thin. They know perfectly, by the sound of the first explosion, where the bombs are falling. If the first bomb sounds hollow and muffled, they do not move from their places, because they know there is no immediate danger. If they can hear the drone of the planes too clearly, or the first explosion is jagged and harsh, they scatter for doorways or refuges. They do this professionally, like soldiers. The pinched women file into the shop and hand their food cards over the high, bare counter. The girls behind the counter look healthy because they are wearing rouge. Then the food is doled out in little grey paper sacks. A sack the size of a cigarette package, full of rice. That will have to do 2 people for 2 weeks. A sack half that big, full of dried peas, for 1 person for 2 weeks. Wait, there's some codfish too. The girl behind the counter pulls out a slab of the grey, white, flat fish and cuts off a little piece with a pair of scissors. She cuts it with scissors, not a knife, because scissors are more accurate. A piece as long as your finger and twice as thick is the ration for 1 person for 2 weeks. The woman with grey hair and the grey frozen face and exhausted eyes reaches out to get her piece of fish. She holds it a minute in her hand, looking at it. They'll look at it and say nothing. Then she turns and pushes her way through the crowd and out the door. Now she will wait every day to hear whether the store in her neighborhood is open again, whether you can trade anything, whether a farmer she knows is coming to town with a dozen eggs and 4 cabbages and some potatoes, whether somewhere, somehow, she can get food for her family. Sometimes when the shop runs out of food before everyone is served, the women are wild with grief, afraid to go home with nothing. Then there's trouble. The little boys don't understand the trouble. All they know is that a quarrel brightens the long hours of waiting. "You don't go to school?" I said. "Not now." "He did very well at school," his grandmother said. "I want to be a mechanic," the child said, in a voice that was almost weeping. "I want to be a mechanic." "We do not let him go to school," Mrs. Hernandez said, stroking the child's black head. "Because of the bombs. We cannot have him walking about alone." "The bombs," I said, and smiled at the boy. "What do you do about the bombs?" "I hide," he said, and he was shy about it, telling me a secret. "I hide so they won't kill me." "Where do you hide?" "Under the bed," he said. The daughter-in-law, who is very young, laughed at this, but the old people treated the child seriously. They know that you must have safety in something. If the child believes he is safe under the bed, it is better for him. "When will the war end?" the daughter-in-law asked suddenly. Now," said the old man. "It will end when we have won it. You know that, Lola. Have patience and do not be silly." "I have not seen my husband for 5 months," the girl explained, as if this were the very worst thing that could ever happen to anyone. Old Mrs. Hernandez nodded her head, which was like a fine, worn wood carving, and made a little sympathetic noise. "You understand, Senora," Mr. Hernandez said to me, "I am so old that perhaps I shall not live to see the end of the war. Things do not make any difference to me any longer. But it will be better for the children afterward. That is what I tell Lola. Spain will be better for her and Federico afterward. Besides," he said, "Federico is learning a great deal in the army." The Internationals had left the lines and were waiting to go home, or were already gone. There was a parade for them down the diagonal, and women threw flowers and wept, and all the Spanish people thanked them somehow, sometimes only by the way they watched the parade passing. The Internationals looked very dirty and weary and young, and many of them had no country to go back to. The German and Italian anti-fascists were already refugees. The Hungarians had no home either. Leaving Spain, for most of the European volunteers, was to go into exile. I wonder what happened to the German who was the best man for night patrols in the 11th International Brigade. He was a sombre man, whose teeth were irregularly broken, whose fingertips were nailless pulp, the first graduate of Gestapo torture I had known. The Spanish Republican Army, which had been growing and shaping itself through 2 winters, now dug in for the third winter of war. They were proud and self-confident soldiers. They had started out militia companies, citizens carrying any sort of rifle, and had become an army and looked like an army and acted like one. In September 1938, the Republican government of Spain, no doubt hoping to shame Franco into a similar gesture, withdrew the International Brigade from the fronts. Four of Mussolini's Italian divisions stayed and fought for Franco until the end of the war. Hitler's artillerymen and pilots also remained. Italian planes were bombing Barcelona when this article was written. They were always a pleasure to see, and often a surprise. On a clear night, coming back very tired from the Segre front, we stopped at divisional headquarters to look at maps and get some dinner too, if lucky. We were received by the lieutenant colonel, who commanded 10,000 men. He was 26 years old, and had been an electrician at Lerida. He was blond and looked American, and he had grown up with the war. The chief of operations was 23, and a former medical student from Galicia. The chief of staff was 27, a lawyer, a Madrid aristocrat who spoke good French and English. Modesto, commanding the army of the Ebro, and a great soldier, was 35. All the new corps commanders were in their late 20s and early 30s. Everybody you saw knew what he was doing and why. It was a cheerful army. The winter is the worst time of all in war, and the third winter is long, cold, and desperate. But you couldn't feel sorry for that army. "Both my boys are soldiers," Mrs. Hernandez said. "Miguel's father is the oldest, Tomas. He's at Tortosa, and Federico is up toward Lerida somewhere. Tomas was here only last week." "What did he say of the war?" I asked. "We do not speak of the war," she said. "He says to me, 'You are like all the other mothers in Spain. You must be brave like all the others.' And sometimes he speaks of the dead." "Yes?" He said, "I have seen many dead." He says that, so I will understand. But we do not speak of the war. "My sons are always close to the bombs," she said in her blurred old voice. "If my children are in danger, it is not well that I should be safe." The girl Lola had started to sing to her child, to keep it quiet, and now she brought the baby over near the lighted wick for me to see. She turned down a greyish blanket showing the child's head and sang, "Pretty little child, my pretty little child." The face seemed shrunken and faded, and bluish eyelids rested lightly shut on the eyes. The child was too weak to cry. It fretted softly with closed eyes, and we all watched it, and suddenly Lola pulled the cover back over the bundle in her arms and said coldly and proudly, "She does not have the right food to eat, and therefore she is not well. But she is a fine child." The hospital was huge and ornate, the way all modern buildings are in Catalonia. This one was built of orange bricks and was a real horror to look at. It was new and well equipped, and had a garden. The buildings, called pavilions, were placed around this garden. The children's pavilion was off to the right, and we followed a lanky, quiet boy who was showing us the way. I did not want to come, really. I knew the statistics. The statistics were enough for me. In Catalonia alone there were approximately 170,000 children up to school age. Of these, the statistics announced, more than 100,000 suffered from bad nutrition, more than 200,000 suffered from undernourishment, more than 100,000 were in a state of pre-famine. I thought the statistics were no doubt mild, and I did not want to think at all about Madrid, about the swift, dark, laughing children in Madrid. I did not want to imagine how hunger had deformed them. There were two great wards, the surgical ward and the medical ward, and it was almost supper time, and the surgical ward was brightly lit. Small beds lined the walls. It was very cold, between the stone floors and the plaster walls. There is no heat anywhere. The children looked like toys until you came closer. Tiny white figures propped up with pillows, swathed in bandages, the little pale faces showing, the great black eyes staring at you, the small hands playing over the sheets. There was not one child in the hospital for any peacetime reason, tonsils, or adenoids, or mastoid, or appendicitis. These children were all wounded. A little boy named Paco sat up in his bed with great dignity. He was 4 and beautiful, and had a bad head wound. He had been crossing a square to meet a little girl on the other side. He played with her in the afternoons. Then a bomb fell. Many people were killed, and he was wounded in the head. He had gone through his pain quietly, the nurse said. The wound was 5 months old. He had always been patient with it, and as the months wore on he grew solemner and more elderly every day. Sometimes he cried to himself, but without making a sound, and if anyone noticed he tried to stop. He stood by his bed and he watched us gravely, but he did not want to talk. I asked if they had anything to play with, and the nurse said, "Well, little things, not much." "No, not really," she said. "Just once in a while someone brings a present for one of them. A jolly little girl, with pigtails and only one leg, was having a nice time making paper balls out of an old newspaper. There were 3 little boys with shaved heads and various splints on them. One of them had his leg held up on a rope from the ceiling. They lived in a corner by themselves. They were not only wounded, but they had tuberculosis. The nurse said they had fever, and that made them gay, particularly at this hour. They would not live. She didn't think they would live, even if there was food to give them, or a sanatorium to send them to. The sanatoriums were all full. Anyhow, they were too far gone. It works very fast on them, the nurse said. The little boys had a sort of mechano toy. It was on the bed of the boy who had a broken arm. A bomb fragment broke his arm, the nurse said. It did not suffer as much as some, but he used to scream at night. The other 2 were now shouting instructions to their friend, how to play with the toy. They were building a bridge. When we stopped beside them, they grew shy and gave up their game. All the children were the color of their pillows except the little ones with TB, who looked quite rosy. They were unbelievably thin. "No," the nurse said almost impatiently, as if it hurt and angered her to talk about it. "Of course we haven't enough food to give them. What do you think? If only they didn't bomb all the time," she said, "it would help. When the children hear the siren, they go crazy. They try to get out of their beds and run. We are only 4 nurses in these 2 rooms, and we have a hard time with them. At night it is worse. They all remember what happened to them, and they go crazy." We went into the second room. A little boy was crying noisily, and the other children were listening to him, frightened by his grief. The nurse explained that he had been wounded today in one of the morning raids, and of course he was in pain, but mainly he was homesick. He wanted his mother. He was also hungry. We stood by his bed helplessly, and promised to bring him some food tomorrow if only he would stop crying, and we promised that his mother would come right away, only please stop crying. He twisted on the bed and sobbed for his mother. Then she came. She was a dark witch of a woman, outdone by life. Her hair strangled from a knot on top of her head, and her bedroom slippers were worn through, and her coat was pinned together with 2 safety pins. She looked gaunt and a little mad, and her voice was as harsh as stone scraping on stone. She sat on the bed. We had been careful not to touch the bed, not to move or shake the small, aching, wounded child, and talked to him in her shrill voice, telling him of the family's catastrophes. Their house had been destroyed by the bomb that wounded him, though he was the only one hurt. But now they had no home, no furniture, nothing to cook with, no blankets, no place to go. She told the round-eyed child the story of woe, that he listened with interest and sympathy and wasn't homesick any more. Then she took a pot from some pocket. It materialized like a rabbit from a hat, and gave it to the child and said, "Here, eat." He began to scoop up cold rice from the pot, just cold rice boiled in water. He ate it, his face close to the pot, spilling a little on the bedclothes and stopping only to collect the greyish rice grains from his fingers. He seemed happy then, and at home. His mother was now talking with another woman, in her heart-tormented voice, and presently the little boy went to sleep. "Would you like to see the medical ward?" the tall, lanky boy said. "Well," I said. "Well, no," I thought. I like the children. So we went. 3 blue lights were burning and the ward was in shadow. The children sat up in bed, silent and waiting. We stepped aside to let the dinner wagon pass. It made a metal clanking sound on the floor, and I watched their eyes follow the wagon down the ward. There was the 7-month-old baby with tuberculosis who did not notice, and there was another child, like an old-faced doll against the pillows, who turned away her head. On the wagon were 4 lumps of something green and cooked, 4 shrunken lettuces, I think, and a great cauldron of soup. The nurse went over to the cauldron and lifted a ladleful and let it spill back into the pot. It was clear, pale beige water. That was supper. "The children cry for food most of the time," she said, looking at the thin soup with hate. "What is the matter with them?" I asked. She evidently thought I was not very sound in the head. "There are only 2 things the matter with them: tuberculosis and rickets." The old-faced doll reached out a tiny white hand. I walked over to her, and her hand curled around my fingers, and she smiled. She was, the nurse said, 17 months old, and her name was Manuela. Manuela let go my fingers and began to cry. Had I done something bad? "Only hungry," the nurse said. She picked the child up lightly and gently and tossed it in her arms. The child laughed aloud with pleasure at this lovely game. As the nurse held her, you saw the rope-thin legs and the swollen stomach of rickets. "Will she be all right?" I said. "Certainly," the nurse said, and she was lying. You could see that in her face. "Certainly she'll get well. She has to, somehow." "Yes, she's a fine child," I said to Lola Hernandez, but I thought, maybe we can stop looking at the child, when we all know she's sick with hunger and probably will not live until summer. Let's talk about something else now, just for a change. "Have you been to the opera?" I said to Lola. "I went once," she said, "but I did not like to go. All the time I was there, I kept thinking, what if this minute my husband is wounded? Or what if he is coming home on leave? I almost thought he had come home, and then I would have missed an hour with him. So now I stay home." "We all stay home," the old man said. "I like the house. We've been here for 25 years. "Do you go often?" Lola asked. "I've been," I said. "It's wonderful. The opera is not as funny as the movies, though the people of Barcelona don't think the movies are funny. But you can't help laughing when you go to see Jane Eyre, and it is all about a life that none of the audience ever knew or imagined. And then in the middle the film flickers off, and you hear the bombs falling somewhere, while the audience groans with irritation, knowing it will take half an hour before the current comes on again, and they are dying to see what happens to Jane and her handsome gentleman friend, and they are fascinated by the mad woman and the burning house. I particularly liked westerns, and seeing the horse stopped in mid-leap for an air alarm, knowing that the dangerous activities of the hero and his horse were much more thrilling to the audience than a mere convoy of bombers flying at a great safe height and sending down indiscriminate expensive steel-encased death and destruction. It costs about 2 pesetas for the best seats at any show, and nobody earns less than 10 pesetas a day. The only thing you want to spend money on is food, and there is no food, so you might as well go to the opera or to the movies. It would be very stupid to save up to buy furniture the way the city gets bombed. Besides, it's warm inside the big over-decorated theaters, because there are so many people, and it's friendly, and sitting there with something to look at on the stage you forget for a while that you aren't really safe. You aren't really safe at all. And also you might even forget how hungry you are. But the opera was a wonder. Some afternoons there was opera, and some afternoons there was the symphony orchestra. The people of Barcelona crowded to both. The opera house was far too near the port for comfort, and bombs had ruined much of the neighborhood. It was surprising that the singers had energy to sing, considering how little they ate. It was surprising to see such thin singers. The women were any age at all, wearing the pre-war costumes, a little mussed now, but still brilliant and romantic. All the men were old. The young men were at war. The opera house was full every day, and everyone enjoyed the music immensely, and roared with laughter at the stale formal opera jokes, and sighed audibly at the amorous moments, and shouted "Olé!" at each curtain. We used to sit and scratch because everyone had fleas this winter. There was no soap any more, and everyone was very dirty and malodorous indeed. But we loved the music, and loved not thinking about the war. The Hernandez's only daughter now came home from her job, and there was much loud gay talk as if they had not seen each other for weeks, with everyone reporting on the day's air raids. She wore her dark hair in braids around her head and was glowing with rouge, and quite well dressed. She earned plenty of money because she worked in a munitions factory. You never know exactly where the munitions factories are, and are not intended to know. We drove over many streets I had not seen before, and stopped before a great grille gateway, somewhere at the edge of the town. The factory looked like a series of cement barns, not connected particularly, and shining and clean and cheerful in the winter sun. We walked across the courtyard and into the first open door. The woman in charge of this room came forward. She had a nice smile, and was timid and behaved as if I had come to tea unexpectedly. The women were working at long tables, helped with shining black squares and oblongs. They looked like trays full of sequins. There were other trays full of shining little leads, like shot fillers for an automatic pencil. The woman picked up a handful of the sequins and let them slip through her hands. "They're pretty, aren't they?" she said. "Very pretty," I said, mystified. "What are they?" "Powder," she said. "Explosive. What makes the shells go off?" At the other end of the room women worked at sewing machines, the old-fashioned kind that you pump with your feet. There was cloth for summer dresses, a lovely pink linen, a nice grey and white stripe that would have made handsome shirts, a thick white silk for a bridal gown. There were sewing little bags and bigger bags like sacks for sachet. A girl came around and collected them and took them to the front of the room, where they were filled with explosives that looked like sequins. Then the little big sachet bag of sequins was dropped into a shell base. Other women carefully and daintily glued together tiny cellophane horseshoes. In these horseshoes was black powder, and this skilled, elegant work served to make a mortar the thing it is. 2 barns farther down were the great guns, home for repair. The place looked like a museum full of prehistoric animals, huge grey, strangely shaped animals come to rest in this smoky room. Men worked beside each gun, with a little fire to heat the tools and for keeping warm. The room twinkled with light from the charcoal burners. The guns all wore their small name tags: Vickers Armstrong, Schneider, Skoda. We had seen them and watched them being fired day after day and month after month at the front. The grooved rifling inside the barrels had been worn smooth from the many thousand rounds they had fired, and the barrels were being rebored. There were few guns in Republican Spain now that had the same caliber they started with, and with each reboring the size of the shells had to be changed. "Would you like to see the shells?" the foreman asked. He was obviously proud of them. He led me out in the sun and around 2 buildings and then into a vast storeroom. Used shell cases, the color of old gold, were stacked neatly against one wall. They would be hammered into shape and used again. In the center of the building and against the right wall, the new shells were piled in squares and oblongs and pyramids. They were painted black and yellow. They were 75s looking neat, and not really harmful at all. And there were the tall shells, the 155s, that frightened one more when they were coming in. We admired the shells, and at this moment, like a dream or a nightmare or a joke, the siren whined out over Barcelona. I think that one of the worst features of an air raid is the siren. The howling, whining whistle rises and screams and wails over the city, and almost at once you hear, somewhere, the deep-hut boom of the bombs. I looked at my companion and he looked at me and smiled. I thinking, foolishly, "Never forget your manners. Walk, do not run." And we sauntered out of doors. I could not see the planes, but I heard them. On a clear day they fly high for safety, so you rarely see them. I thought anyhow, in a case a bomb falls around here, we won't even know it. "What do the workers do?" I said. "Nothing," he said. "They wait." The planes now showed themselves clear and silver just a little way down the sky dotted with a few small white smoke bubbles from anti-aircraft shells. The men came out of the factory and walked across the courtyard and leaned against a wall where they could get a better view, and smoked. Some played an innocent game, pitching a coin. The women dragged out empty packing cases, in which bullets would be shipped later, and sat down in the sunshine and started knitting. They did not bother to look up. Everyone knew that the electricity was turned off for half an hour, so there would be no more work for a time. They knitted and gossiped, and watching the sky I saw the silver planes wheel and circle and fly back out to sea. They all like working in a munition factory because they get 2 rolls of bread each day as a bonus. "I must leave," I said. "Please forgive me for staying so long. Goodbye, Miguel. After the war you'll be a mechanic." "After we have won the war," old Mrs. Hernandez corrected me. "We will invite you to come here and eat a big supper with us." They were all delighted with winning the war and delighted with eating a big supper. "You will see Federico too," Lola said. "Yes," I said. "That will be a great pleasure." "Goodbye, goodbye," I said, shaking hands all around, "and many thanks." We were standing up now, and looking at them I suddenly said, "The 3rd winter is the hardest." Then I felt ashamed. They were strong, brave people, and didn't need me to say cheering words to them. "We are all right, Senora," Mrs. Hernandez said, making it clear at once, saying the last word in her home about her family. "We are Spaniards, and we have faith in our republic."